Welcome to a special episode of Ramblings of a Geek. I actually have a fantastic guest with me today. We're going to be talking all about budgeting. This is the right time of year to be talking about budgeting. And so I brought an expert from the industry in to talk about it. He and I both have some things to share. You all know me since you've hopefully been watching some of my videos, but not many of you probably know Danny. So Danny, I'd love it if you would just do a quick intro for yourself and then we'll get right into the content.
Yeah, sure thing. So Daniel Hanley here, long-time MSP industry veteran. I am also a SaaS founder within the space. We've got a business intelligence platform called Delmar Insights, and I also offer consulting to a host of MSP clientele.
Very good. And like I said, we're talking about budgeting today, and budgeting is one of those really important things, and it takes some muscle memory to get good at. We were going to talk about, the why budgeting is so important, what typically is in a budget, and so in like kind of the how you can go about doing your budget. And Danny and I both have a bunch of things to talk about. So let's get right into it, and we'll start jumping right in. So let's start with the why. So Danny, why do you think budgeting is critical?
I mean, look, from my perspective, you always want to see where you're going, right? And we talked about this time of year being a good time of year. And when we start thinking about year-end planning, that's when we want to be thinking about where are we trying to get to? Now, certainly you have the long-term goals of the 3 to 5 year plan, but realistically, just from an operational execution standpoint, knowing where you want to end in, say, 2025 is critical to determining what the end of this year looks like and how you set yourself up for success. And budgeting is a critical part of that.
Absolutely. And a couple of other things that kind of come to mind too, especially coming off of peer groups last week, is that when your company sets a budget and hits a budget and does it over and over and over again, when it comes time to sell your company, your valuation is going to be higher. So the important part here is to start wherever you are. And if the first year is just you're way off, don't worry about it. It is a thing that's going to take you a couple of cycles to get better at. And that's why we want you to start now versus, waiting for, the perfect time to start. So when we think about what goes into a budget, there's a number of things that we like to think about, and you can see them on the screen here. But for me, I think that your budget needs to kind of contain a number of things, right? You need to worry about your revenue. In the MSP space, we care a lot about our cost of goods sold or our COGS. You also have to worry about and think about expenses. And ultimately, you're trying to land on solid gross margin and EBITDA numbers. Danny, what do you think the most important pieces of kind of figuring out this budget or the components that go in your budget are?
It's interesting that you provide this sort of visualization of it all, because I think it's a really good way to sort of think about where on this spectrum you are. So you mentioned valuation earlier. At the end of the day, what your goals are today may differ from what they are tomorrow. And so I think that that's really where you should begin. For example, if you are heavily focused on growth, then the area where you're going to want to spend the most time here is going to be on the revenue, right? If at the end of the day, profitability has been a struggle and you're trying to, keep the ship above water, if you will, then we're going to focus more on our COGS and ultimately our expenses as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. When I was talking to one of the other industry experts that I know last week in our peer group meetings, so we were talking about, high revenue but low margin companies. And sometimes, to your point, if you were trying to grow, adding more revenue is good. And you can actually, if you're looking to sell your business at some point, your gross margin and EBITDA, of course, make a ton of sense to maximize as much as you can. Sometimes the top line revenue is a pretty good way of selling, and you actually can generate a pretty good return, presuming you've been able to grow. So for example, most MSPs are started by a tech usually, right? Well, every once in a while, you'll have an MSP that's run by a business person or a salesperson, and maybe that salesperson is just closing deal after deal after deal after deal, but they're not great at dealing with the efficiencies of things. Sometimes those companies, if you're able to kind of continually hit those growth targets you're aiming at, can be quite valuable, even if you're not hitting the gross margin and EBITDA that you're hoping for, just because a company coming in can sometimes turn that ship around a little bit too. It's an interesting concept. Of course, you want to hit all the things and you want to be super efficient in all those pieces, but I've definitely seen some situations where, you want to aim at something that's important to you and that's going to move the needle for your business.
No, that makes sense. And if we want to continue with the valuation analogy here, we certainly can do that. I mean, I look at this spectrum, as I sort of referenced it before, as I mean, these are different points along what your potential value could be, right? And so, for example, you're going to win points towards that valuation, whether it's, the thing that I'm great at is sales, or the thing that I'm great at is operational efficiency, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or the thing that I'm great at is just building a phenomenal tech stack that my customers love, right? Whatever that thing is, you're certainly going to have an opportunity to win points towards what that final valuation might be. But as you look to hone in on your budgeting, I think it's key to try to hit on all of these numbers as best you possibly can.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah. And again, if you've never budgeted before, don't be freaked out when your budget is off the first time you go through it. So this is a learned skill set, and it takes some repetitions to get through. So this is one of those things that's better to start today and not have it perfectly dialed in and improve over the course of the next couple of years.
And Adam, that actually brings me to another key point. We haven't quite gotten there yet in terms of our discussion today, but the way that you approach budgeting is going to be critical to your results. And again, some of that trial and error is definitely going to come into play, and you may want to try it 2 or 3 different ways before you land on what works the best for you and your company.
For sure. Well, when we're talking about the kind of the how and things to take a look at, why don't we jump right into that, and let's talk about some of the things that we need to do for budgeting, right? So how can you go about budgeting? Like I mentioned right away off the jump of this conversation, is you got to plan ahead, right? This is the right time of year to do it. And if you wait too much longer, you're very likely going to be budgeting for 2025 in 2025, which is not really want to be.
I was just going to say that, if you're doing that, you're really almost doing a different exercise, and that's forecasting, right? And we could talk about where that becomes super important and a best practice as you get better at budgeting, but having that core budget set in advance is huge.
So then let's talk about the top down and bottom up and historical is zeroed, and let's talk about kind of the mechanics of budgeting. And Daniel, if you would you just talk a little bit about top down versus bottom up, and we'll go from there.
Sure, yeah, we can absolutely do that. As far as your top down versus your bottom up, I mean, the way that I think of it is, it's really, are you as an owner or a founder, are you the one responsible for setting the stakes, right? Or how much are you going to leverage your team? Now, in an ideal world, they're going to find a balance between both of those things that make sense for you. But let's just say, depending on the size of your organization, it's either going to be you as a smaller MSP or business owner who's going to be setting those sort of key strategic goals, or potentially you and your executive team, if we're talking about a larger organization, right? That can be, especially when we all think about the fact that there is only so much time in the day. Top-down budgeting can be a great way to get started, because at the end of the day, one, you're closest to the decision makers, right? You have visibility into all the numbers that you need to be able to see. You can get it done. You can get it done quickly, and you can centralize your decision making, right? Those are some pros as far as the top-down budgeting approach is concerned. Some things to think about as you do that, right? And as you kind of go through the motions of building out your best practice budgeting approach within your organization is, you're going to be limiting some of the input from the respective stakeholders that may be critical in delivering on the budget. You certainly could set unrealistic expectations especially in larger organizations, if you're further from the ground truth.
For sure.
And then ultimately you risk, losing engagement from the team as you go through that process.
Yeah, I'd love to tell a quick story about my situation at one of my former companies, because I think it was a really smart way for my company to handle it. So for the longest time, we kind of didn't really budget. And then we decided we were going to budget for the first time. We did everything kind of top down. We said, all right, let's just take a swing at this, and let's just take an idea of what this is going to look like. And then we watched it for the year. We figured out where we maybe made some mistakes and where we did pretty well. And then we started incorporating a little bit more bottom up as we got through a couple iterations of the budget throughout the course of a couple of years. Because as a company, when it was the first time for us, it became the first time for us to budget, we weren't quite ready to do from the bottom up. This is very much like, let's set the benchmarks. Let's see where we're going to be. We'll talk about it with the managers. We'll talk about it with the staff a little bit. But we know that we're not going to be perfect. And so it will allow us to kind of iterate a little bit. What do you think about that? Do you think that's a solid play, especially if it's a first time kind of going through it?
Yeah, I mean, again, I would kind of lean towards what is the size of the organization that we're talking about. So like,
Sure.
for example, Adam, I'm not sure how big the team was that you're referring to, but I originally cut my teeth in sort of enterprise budgeting. And we almost had this multi-tiered approach where, there was going to be a top-down budget that was set by the board or with
Oh,
the
sure, sure.
board in mind. There was going to then additionally be a budget set at the management layer. And
Hmm.
then we would go through the additional exercise one layer down of saying, okay, now frontline managers, what do you think that you need? What do you see you being able to deliver on for next year? And
Sure.
then ultimately that process, I mean, when you do it at those three different stages, at those different levels, it can be a 3 month process, which very much speaks to why we're starting this conversation now.
Exactly. Well, and if you think about the average MSP size, let's just say the average MSP is somewhere in that $1 to $5 million range, and there's plenty that are smaller and plenty that are bigger. But for the most part, the people that are likely to watch this video are going to be somewhere in that smaller range. It's definitely like an owner, a service manager, maybe a COO. You start as you get close to the 5+ million range, you start to add some additional layers of executive management. So it almost has to be top down to begin with because it's just you don't have enough staff to do a bottom up. You'd say, "Hey, service manager, what do you need for a budget next year?" And they're going to look at you like a deer in the headlights, probably. So there's a way to kind of handle this and the way to kind of iterate over time. So I think that's an important piece of it. So let's talk for a minute about historical or zeroed, and this is important to me with the idea that there's a couple ways of doing it. And if you search, if you Google for how to budget or whatever, you can get all kinds of terms, right? And I think there's kind of two kind of normal ways that people work their way through the budget, right? Which historical being you just basically take last year's numbers and you iterate on it based on projected growth or shrinkage, depending on what that looks like, or zeroed where you kind of zero everything out and you basically have to fight for every different line item. Now, on the on the plus side, the historical side is much faster, right? If you're going to zero everything out, it's going to take you a long time. So the historical stuff is a much more rapid way to get through the budget. Opponents of the zeroed side will say, actually, with zero though, you have to make sure that you're spending all the money wisely. And that's kind of what those two things mean, and that's mostly kind of to kind of level set for everybody. But Danny, if you think about the average MSP that's going to watch this video, where do you think they probably should start?
So in my experience working with MSPs, budgeting is let's call it an afterthought. It's something that is learned behavior as their maturity level increases. And so for that reason, I think historical is just a natural place to start because at the end of the day, again, we kind of hinted at this earlier. We're low on time, right? We know that this is an important step forward. So how do we find a way to begin this exercise without it consuming our day-to-day life as we go through the process? And so historical, again, you have a reference point, you know what you've been able to achieve in the past. And so therefore that becomes the benchmark for what you think you can achieve in the future. Zeroed for me is sort of something you'd want to approach at two different times. One, let's say you're a new company who's just thinking about being financially mature. And so you want budgeting to be a part of your build process. 100%, you don't have a choice. You're going to be jumping right into a zeroed approach, right? Almost business planning, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
What do I think that I can grow this business to here in the initial stages? The other side of this is, again, as that maturity level increases, as you as the business owner are able to spend less time in the day-to-day and more time focused on the strategic initiatives of where you want to be next year, 3 years, 5 years down the line, that's when I'd say zero just becomes an exercise in who you want to be, right?
Sure.
And then can you start to marry that to where you are historically?
Love it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And similar to the top down versus bottom up, you're pretty much always going to start with the historical, just because zeroed is frankly a daunting task anyway. If you've never done a budget before, starting with zeroed is a big ask, especially if you're north of $1 million in revenue, right? Because there's a lot that goes on in there. So this is one of those things where you might want to level up over time and iterate a little bit. And there's really nothing to say that you can't just do a historical budget and basically make every different department say, okay, what are we really going to spend on some of the stuff, and approach it a little bit more zeroed, but you're still using the previous year as a reference point too.
Absolutely.
So then when it comes to the last thing, right, and this budget thing, is a little bit like a business plan, right? Where you set the goals for the year, you think about what you want to do, but you don't want to just set it in October or November of the previous year and then expect just to kind of hit the numbers at the end of next year. So Daniel, talk to me about what you think a good ongoing review process should look like, and what should MSPs be paying attention to as it relates to their budgeting practices as you go through the year.
Yeah, and to that point, and I may have even alluded to this earlier with some foreshadowing around forecasting, but yeah, I mean let's root it in some ground truth examples. Let's say you lose your biggest client in January.
Right.
You finish your budget in December. It was
right.
Completely blindsided. Happened to be that a company either closed a deal and they got bought out, or they went under, whatever the case may be. You now have a choice ahead of you, right? You either just go into it and saying, hey, I created this budget and I guess now I'm going to miss it, or I'm going to just try to figure it out. Or you level set and you say, okay, it's good that I have this initial budget. I still have my end of year goals in mind, but let's start rethinking how we get from January to December. Reset the baseline, look at what changes that you want to make, and then reproject the year starting in February.
Yeah, I think one of the things that comes to mind too as we think about ongoing reviews is trying to make sure that, especially if you're projecting some revenue growth and some sales growth, that the money that or the new sales that are closed in January are literally more valuable to your budget than sales closed in June, July, August through the end of the years. When you're building your budget and kind of watching your way through it and doing the ongoing review process, it's really important that your sales team is ready to hit the ground running, whether that's just that owner-led sales, or whether you have a full-on sales team. So it's that kind of stuff too. It's as a kind of paying attention to the budget, you have to watch all the different components of the business more so than watching the big budget overall, right? It's are you hitting your daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly marks in some of the daily activities? And I think it's really important as business owners that as you think about budgeting and forecasting and all those kinds of things, you tie that to the daily activities that you expect your team to do, so that way they're able to really see when they do on an ongoing basis, how it improves and helps the business overall as well.
That makes perfect sense. I mean, let's say that you have a small sales team in place. What are you doing to help them achieve their goals each month, right?
Right.
To help them achieve their goals each quarter. I would also just, take a step back, and before we create this daunting task for anyone who may be listening that hasn't budgeted before, is thinking about it, and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to redo this thing every month. I just can't. This is not going to be sustainable for me. Forget that. As a starting point, most of us are not going to, as we mentioned as an example, lose our biggest client, right?
Right.
We would love to also sign the biggest client we've ever had. And some years that happens out of nowhere. But realistically, if we're going steady Eddie, the key to budgeting, at least in initial ongoing reviews, is just making sure that you're revisiting it. I think it's fair to say if you've invested the time in creating your first budget for the new year, at least once a quarter, take the time, review it, see where you've landed, and then decide, right? Are there any things that I want to change going into this next quarter? Or do I feel good about what we've achieved and we're going to hold steady?
That's a great point, because if you ever hear me talk about finance, MSP finance at all, I'm always talking about reviewing your P&L monthly and quarterly and those kinds of things. Well, that quarterly review process with your P&L is a great time to bring that budget out, and you bring it out, you match them up, you see how are we doing so far, right? And it's just it's a check-in, and once you kind of go through this a couple of different times, and if you're going to build a quarterly forecast, it's also a really good time to do that as well. It's a little bit outside of the scope of our conversation today, but this is one of those things where just building a solid, repeatable process to kind of like check back in on your financials is just so valuable to your company.
I couldn't agree more.
So as we're kind of getting ready for putting this presentation and conversation together, Danny brought forth a really awesome checklist. And so, Danny, I'd love it if you would just walk us through this checklist, of which this is just like the scratching the surface of some of the things you want to think about. But would you just walk us through, talk us through some of the items on your checklist?
Yeah, absolutely. And for the purposes of this recording, right, we ultimately wanted to be able to set up something that everyone could relate to. In reality, depending on your circumstances, this budget checklist will change, it will grow, it will get more detailed. And that's something that when we're working with a budgeting client, we ultimately dive into based on the circumstances. Look, first and foremost, everybody has to have data, right? As far as gathering the data, where are you going to be getting it from? Again, it depends on sort of how detailed that you want your budget to be. It should be, for those that are starting out for the first time, it should be as simple as looking at your P&L as a starting point, right? It can be a great way to get off the ground, and it allows you to sort of lay out that historical and then ultimately lay out your budget in the way that you're used to seeing it. As far as then setting those financial goals, we did sort of mention that already. What is your goal for next year? And whenever I'm setting a budget, that's the first thing that's top of mind. What are we trying to achieve? Are we going to be focusing on sales? Are we focusing on profitability? What are going to be the levers that we're going to pull on, right? And then, this idea of analyzing the market, right? It's sort of, I now know that I have the information that I need, right? And I've established what I want to achieve. Now, the question is, what's feasible within the environment that we're currently in? I mean, ultimately, this past year was a good example, right? Rates were tremendously high, spending stalled in certain areas. These are things to be aware of if you're, say, going to be looking at a fast growth approach, right? On the flip side, if your own expenses have been ratcheting up over the last year, 2 years, 3 years, in our case, you definitely want to be aware of those things going into it, because last year's expenses may not be next year's.
Fair enough.
Yeah. And then, I mean, in terms of estimated revenue, if we're going to start here, be realistic. Know what you can actually achieve, right? Don't set yourself up for failure.
Yeah, don't project a whale client signing, right? Unless you have a repeated habit of hitting a whale every single year for the last 5 years. Don't project a thing that just is super unlikely to happen. I've seen that happen too many times with people's budgeting. We're going to knock sales out of the park, and we're going to grow by 30%. And you say, well, what did you grow by last year? So what are you going to do to get to 30%, right? Being realistic is about all this stuff, right? The last thing you want to do is set some sort of, BHAG or a big, hairy, audacious goal when it comes to budgeting, because that's not likely to happen. And you don't want this to be a thing that, makes you frustrated every time you look at it, for sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's take another example there and say you've just hired a new sales team, right? And maybe you set some BHAGs because that's what you expect them to achieve, right? But understand that there's going to be a ramp involved. And if you've never proved that you can do it with the outside sales rep before, there's no guarantees that you will this time. So be realistic.
100%. So let's talk about the next section of stuff here, like your COGS and expenses and those kinds of things.
For sure. I think we started to hint on some of this as far as whether or not your environment has begun to change, right? Should you be aware of increasing costs for some or all of your vendors? That certainly can be the case. As far as your COGS, you definitely want to be aware of how they have been growing and changing over time. So, for example, are you getting more efficient? Are you remaining the same? Or are you starting to see additional layers of management that are potentially making your team less efficient? Really critical when sort of evaluating the state of your tech team.
I was gonna say also, don't, if you're forecasting a number of new sales, right? Let's say you did hire a sales team, and after they get ramped up, you might need to forecast a new hire or two in there, depending on that growth pattern too. So thinking about when that might happen, obviously you can adjust it throughout the year, but those are things to think about as well. So if you're forecasting a lot of new client sales, especially if you've had some sort of track record there, make sure you're budgeting in for hiring people to service those clients, because the last thing you want to do is bring on a bunch of new clients and have them all be frustrated with you.
Yeah, and that's huge. And we've talked about vendor expenses, which can affect both COGS and expenses, but we all know our largest expense is going to be our staff. So
Yep.
Planning ahead of our hiring schedule and what we anticipate seeing in the coming year is going to be critical here.
Absolutely. So then let's head below the lines. Let's talk about some of those operating expenses.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, if we're thinking about a high growth, which we kind of have referenced already, marketing and sales expenditures are both going to be things we want to consider, not necessarily just the headcount, but where am I going to be investing other money to help support that team? If you haven't done it already, it may be worthwhile to get some quotes before budgeting season is completed.
For sure.
On the same side, what other items might you want to consider? I mean, we have rent here mentioned, right? Which again, rent can go up. We've seen a lot of rent changes here in the last couple of years, but maybe you want to flip the script. Maybe you're thinking about, buying that new building. right?
Hmm.
And moving your team into your own space. I mean, that can have a critical impact on what the budget looks like for next year, right? Completely bringing out some of those ongoing expenses and changing it into like a capital expenditure discussion.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about as you were talking through that. We just talked about this last week during peer groups. We had a member that they were coming at the end of their lease and they were just looking for a place to rent, and they talked to a couple different people and they said you could just go buy this building, and they said, hey, we actually have cash in the business where we can pay for a large portion of the down payment, like without having to do anything special. We had the sort of this rainy day fund, and they were able to say, let's pivot and let's do this because it's going to be ultimately better for the long-term financial health of the organization anyway. So it's a great call out.
Yeah, and you as an organization or you as an entrepreneur, you may even be able to create an additional revenue stream depending on what opportunities are available to you.
Absolutely, especially if you're going to sublet pieces of it out or whatever too. So
Exactly. So yeah, next thing here is consider seasonality. I think that's something that comes up a lot, and I think a lot of times in our industry we discount seasonality, but it's definitely something that occurs, right? Whether it's something that occurs based on your own sales cycle and the way that you operate as a team, or if it's a matter of the way that you're operating your business. As a matter of fact, the thing that I see probably the most of is people are very conservative about their cash expenditures early in the year. And as they start to see where they're going to land at the end of the year, they realize what additional money that they have to spend, right? And then that ultimately has an impact on what your bottom line is going to look like for Q4. And so keeping those kinds of things in mind can be very important.
and I think a lot of that comes into that with that ongoing review process too, right? Because having a big pile of cash to spend at the end of the year is sometimes kind of fun, but might it have been better to have had that cash to spend in June, right? And if you're paying attention to those kinds of things, there may have been a better use of that money in June versus buying new laptops for everybody or something kind of different at the end of the year, just because you're trying to lower your taxable income kind of a thing.
Yeah. And I mean, tying this back to something that you already mentioned, Adam, if we know in a recurring business that our cascading success depends on what we do early on in the year, being able to invest, for example, in
Hmm.
growth earlier in the year is certainly going to be better than doing so later.
For sure.
The last one that we really want to mention is this checklist component here. And again, ultimately, there are several other items that we could have added to this list, but I think these are the hot topics we really wanted to hit on. It's just a factor in taxes. I mean, you definitely always want to consult your tax expert when needed, but ultimately, you have historical record, for example, of how much it costs you either in sales taxes or overall income taxes. Making sure that you consider that as a part of the plan is another important step, and really kind of the bow on top, if you will.
Absolutely. Yeah. One quick thing on taxes is this is a great time of year to talk to your tax professional, tax lawyer, CPA, to layer in what you think next year is going to look like, because there's more that they can do for you before the year's already in progress. And there's things that you can set up for the next year to be able to take advantage of certain things. Absolutely talk to your tax professional now is a great time, especially after the all October due dates are done with too. So now this is a good time for this to strategize with some of those folks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just tie it back to another one of our examples we talked about, potential capital expenditures, maybe buying your own building. And that is just one of many examples of when you'd want to talk it through with your tax professional.
Absolutely. So let's put a bow on our conversation today. Let's talk about some next steps, right? There's a number of things that we can do and that we're recommending you do. And the first thing is pick a budgeting tool, right? And Danny, I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about the tool and the services that you guys use, because I know you have a pretty thought out business line that talks about this.
Sure, absolutely. And again, I kind of mentioned earlier that I had cut my teeth in sort of enterprise budgeting, if you will. And I think that there was a large budget for tools at that time, right? Across different departments, things of that nature. I mean, ultimately, when I set out to found Delmar Insights and sort of create business intelligence platform that worked for small and medium sized businesses like MSPs, I still took some of those things to heart and said, hey, what other items could we sort of bring into a broader tool like this? And budgeting was just a natural fit, right? So our tool really allows you to kind of do that ongoing check that we talked about, right? We'll help you set up an initial budget, and then once it's actually in place, at a summary P&L view, we can kind of review our progress as we go. And ultimately, if you need to make changes as the year goes as well.
Very good. Danny and Delmar Insights is a great option. There are a little bit more kind of DIY options for you as well. I teach a course over at Pax8 in the Pax Academy side of the world. We actually have a budgeting spreadsheet that you can use. It's pretty well thought out. It kind of ties into a number of different pieces. You can get that from us by just taking a course or two with Pax8 Academy. And if nothing else, and if all of these are outside your ability to grab some time or some effort into the tool side of the world, there's a decent tool from Intuit. We'll throw some links down in the video description to talk about that as well. But it's very much, get what you're going to pay for, right? The free tool is the free tool. The next piece is collect your data, right? So this is get your stuff together, gather the data. If you have previous years, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world to grab some previous years, at least to sanity check what you're looking at. Danny, any commentary on that at all?
So without getting too deep into it, one thing I will always caution folks of is make sure that you're confident in your data. Let's not run before we walk. If for any reason that you don't feel like your data is complete or clean enough to use for these types of purposes, I would definitely recommend that initiative as a step one.
What about if their data is not clean and complete? What would you say if a company is like, you know what, this budgeting thing, we're going to do our best, and we're going to do a lot of thumb in the wind calculations of things. But what if they use the next year as a way to make sure they had clean data so that way they could budget better in 26? What do you think about that as a concept?
I think that's a great idea. It's actually what we recommend to a lot of our clients. Typically, if you're serious about moving forward, there's no reason why you can't do both at the same time. Just make sure that as a part of that initial budgeting process, you say, what is it that I need to clean up? And often you can determine that by deciding what it is that you want to track, which comes back to that goal setting approach that we talked about at the beginning.
Very good. So then once you have your data, you have your tool, it's time to get going, right? It's time to block off some time on your calendar, get it done, spend the time, think about the numbers, and really make a plan for the next year. Even if you don't hit all the numbers, you're still going to be a lot closer by the end of next year than you would if had you done none of that. So, Dan, do you have any recommendations there?
Yeah, I'll say this as a final plug. Ultimately, the getting moving part can be the toughest part. Mm-hmm. And if it's daunting to think about this from a DIY perspective, I mean, that's ultimately why we do some of the things that we do. Whether it's us or another professional, there are people out there that are ready to help and that have been through this before. So don't hesitate to reach out.
Absolutely. Yeah. The inertia for that initial action can be really, really hard to overcome. But once you get it overcome and you start getting into it, it gets a lot easier. So, Danny, I'd love it if you would spend a minute or two talking a little bit more about your business and tell people where they can find you. And of course, I'm going to throw the links to your LinkedIn, your website, and all those different pieces in the description of this video. But tell us a little bit about Delmar Insights and some of the things that you do for MSPs everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So Delmar Insights at its core, it's a SaaS company, right? And we have a business intelligence platform that's curated for MSPs. Our core focuses are around sort of financial health, which is a lot of what we're talking about today, operational efficiency, and sales and marketing growth. And all of what we make available as a part of that broader platform and its tools hits on one of those marks. So we provide support from a consulting perspective as well. And if these are things that you've been putting off or you're ready to make that next step in terms of increasing your own visibility and ratcheting up your successes, and that's exactly what we built it for.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you for your time. Thanks for all of the pre-calls and the work that we've kind of put in to put this together. Definitely looking forward to seeing you maybe at an upcoming peer group. Would love to pick your brain in real time and in real life as well. And thanks for coming on this ramble with me, and hope to see you on the next one.